Top story this week. You die if you want to. The lady is not for dying. Oh, hold on, scratch that. I think I'll give it a go. It's Maggie Thatcher, Death Catcher. Well, what an emotional week it has been for Britain, Andy. The 87-year-old former Prime Minister and political juggernaut Margaret Thatcher has died. And it may be very hard for people around the world to understand the kind of strange emotional rollercoaster that Britain has been on over the last 7 days, as many people are forced to navigate some complicated feelings regarding how to justify feeling slightly less than sorrowful over the death of a frail, vulnerable old lady. It's been halfway between a celebration and a memorial this week. It's essentially been a celebrorial. And if you saw some of the scenes on TV of impromptu street parties over the death of Margaret Thatcher, you might understandably think people in Britain are a bunch of heartless and to some extent, you'd be right. Seeing 18-year-olds dancing around after the death of a woman whose time in power they never directly experienced, albeit the aftershocks of which they undoubtedly felt, is not an entirely heartwarming experience, and it's only going to get more complicated from here. The official full ceremonial funeral is going to take place on Wednesday in London at ironically high cost to the taxpayer, a final hypocrisy haiku in a controversial career. Now, apparently, Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not officially a state funeral, although it's going to be fucking difficult to tell the difference, because there's apparently not going to be a military flyover, but there's going to be pretty much everything else. Is that right? Yeah, that's basically it. It is a state funeral in all apart from name, including specifically, as you say, in price tag. And it's been, I think it's fair to say, more than a little bit controversial, because she was a woman who didn't just split opinion, but slathered it with ice cream and popped a glacé cherry on top. And also, interestingly, within minutes, John, of her death being announced, there was a great debate on how it should be commemorated, not just in society in Britain as a whole, but also amongst buglers, particularly through the Bugle Twitter feed, with a lot of people asking whether or not she would get, or demanding that she should get, a eulogy. And, you know, that's a tough philosophical question to address, John, right, because, as you know, you set the bar pretty high for eulogies, and we try to maintain that in this franchise. We don't just hand them out to anyone. You've got to really earn them. And you might say set alongside Bin Laden, Gaddafi and Kim Jong-il. There's no way a woman even as divisive as Thatcher deserves a eulogy. But you would also say set alongside Churchill, the Duke of Wellington and Isaac Newton. She sure as doesn't deserve a state funeral, which is, as you say, essentially what she's got. Funded by the taxpayers, a large percentage of whom would only be happy to contribute if their money was being used to pay for a giant 50-metre-high middle finger made of coal to be paraded 10 yards behind her coffin. Also, Parliament was recalled to pay tribute to her a few days earlier than it would otherwise have done. Will that have made many difference? Was she going to get any more or less dead in those intervening days? Perhaps she was. Apparently, Tory Central Office was reportedly disappointed and surprised that as of 3 days after her death, there had still been no resurrection. They issued a statement saying, "We assume it's just been some kind of administrative hold-up. According to precedent, it should have happened by now. It's probably to do with paperwork. Thank you, Brussels." So, a very good suggestion was sent in by a bugler called Don from New York, who suggested that while she maybe doesn't warrant a full state eulogy, she is definitely worthy of a ceremonial eulogy. No one knows exactly what the difference is, says Don, but it looks like you're taking the controversial nature of the relevant corpse into account in arriving at a middle position. Very statesmanlike.
That is a very good way to straddle that problem, Andy.
Yes, I don't know what your view on this, John, as the man who created the term, the institution that is the eulogy.
Yeah, well, it's important to withhold it, Andy.
Right.
And, you know, is dismantling society over a decade enough? I'm afraid the bar is higher than that at the moment. Who knows? Someday it may be watered down, but I think it's cerebrorial time, Andy. It's not full eulogy. There is going to be blowout media coverage on Wednesday, regardless of this not quite state with an uppercase S funeral. And maybe this has actually come at a good time for Britain, Andy. Last year we had the royal wedding, we had the Olympics. We've been looking for another reason to put on a show for the world, and I guess this will have to do for now. The problem is going to be how to produce the spectacle necessary when everyone's feelings regarding the person in question are so complicated. British people are notoriously not particularly well in touch with their emotions. So how are we going to fake our way through a funeral, Andy? Maybe we need to get in some of those professional mourners or some of those terrified-looking crying people who were lining the streets at Kim Jong-il's funeral. That's when you will know officially, as a member of the world, if the British people have decided we're not up to publicly grieving, Andy, because we won't have enough tears in the tank. If all the shots, you will know, if all the shots of the procession in London on Wednesday feature hordes of frightened North Koreans, that's how you'll know that we've basically given up and gone to Plan B. The scale of the funeral will reportedly be along the same lines as those for Princess Diana and the Queen Mother, and the public cost, as we're mentioning, has raised some eyebrows, as it doesn't seem to sit well for someone who in her lifetime was so against public spending of any kind that she said about privatising the living shit out of everything. Surely it would be far more appropriate, Andy, to find a way to have the private sector take care of this. Have sponsorship up the side of her coffin like a race car, and have product placement during the eulogy. Yes, it will be slightly inhuman, but what more appropriate way could there possibly be to bid farewell to one of the most calculating politicians in recent memory? And also, Andy, that would open up the potential for us to pay for a much more spectacular ceremony than the one we're currently able to, which might satisfy both sides. It would mean we could have a giant inflatable Belgrano, the Argentine ship that was shot in the back during the Falklands. We could then have her coffin in the shape of a pointy torpedo and carry it into the back of the inflatable ship, puncturing it and deflating it as a hologram Ronald Reagan cheers and then bursts into tears and attempts to throw himself into Thatcher's grave before her. Again, yes, it would be tasteless, but isn't that what she would have wanted?
She was, as you say, an incredibly divisive figure in this country. She polarised this nation like a celebrity chef smearing a grizzly bear in cream cheese and buying it a one-way ticket to the North Pole. And she was a sort of a political Medusa, that if you looked into her policies, it would simply turn you to stone. She was a dominatrix in a parliament of submissives. And if you want to know the relationship between Thatcher and her party, anytime you see footage of her talking in parliament, imagine all the grey men sitting behind her wearing gimp masks. And I think that will show you exactly what Britain was like in the 1980s.
Andy, I guess this Bugle's going to probably be about half an hour. But really, you only need to listen to that sentence to perfectly evoke what Britain is going through this week. To indicate some of the complications that are ahead of us, the Premier League did not ask clubs to observe a minute's silence at any football games this weekend, which upset a number of people, especially Thatcher's former sports minister Richard Tracy, who said, "Frankly, I think it's rather cheap that they decided not to show any sort of respect for her, because, to be honest, she really did deliver what football is today." And exactly, Andy. He's not wrong about that. She really did deliver what football is today, an unregulated commercial nightmare. Plus, let's not forget her and her government's response to the Hillsborough disaster, which guaranteed that if you asked football fans to observe the life of Margaret Thatcher, you might get a minute of something, but it sure as shit wouldn't be silence. In fact, there might actually be something in that, Andy. Maybe they should have suggested a minute's noise across the country, just so you could make any primal sound that you wanted in relation to Margaret Thatcher. It might have been cathartic for the whole of Britain. Some could cry, others could cheer, many could cry at the others cheering, some could moo, but all could find a way to process their feelings.
Well, I think it could be even simpler than that. It could just have a compulsory pantomime booing, I think. Minute's silence and then a minute's pantomime booing, punctuated by shouts of, "He's behind you," referring perhaps to the way she was ousted from power by being stabbed in the back by her own party, the same party that has effectively politically canonised her this week. I don't know if you saw any of the parliamentary debate in which Parliament was recalled just to pay tribute to Thatch. I don't know if were you in Australia for that, or were you glued to your television?
I think I was probably on my way back. I didn't
Right.
see it.
You probably could feel the reverberations in the aeroplane as she flew around the other side of the world. But I don't know, probably some buglers might have seen it, some probably didn't. But if any buglers out there who've ever been wondering what it would look like to see 300 Tory MPs simultaneously masturbating, I think that is probably as close as we will ever get in this world.
There have been some pretty objectively distasteful responses to her death this week. There were impromptu street parties and an internet campaign to try to get the song Ding Dong the Witch is Dead to number 1 on the British singles charts. The problem is that the time for celebration at Thatcher being gone was probably November 1990 when she left office and was no longer relevant. The problem with that problem is that she hasn't really stopped being relevant at any point since. Ex-Prime Minister Tony Blair, perhaps a little nervous about the future response to his passing, criticised those people who'd held street parties to celebrate Thatcher's death, saying that they were in pretty poor taste. And I don't think there's any denying that that is true. The only argument is whether that lack of taste is appropriate or not. He then urged the critics to show some respect. And I think there has to be a balancing feeling to people's responses here, Andy, because I think there's just bound to be an inclination to push back against some of the eulogising of her time in office that you just mentioned. I've felt that way, Andy, and I haven't been in Britain this week, where I'm sure you've been taking a saccharine shower in Iron Lady lionising, and that can't have been easy to take.
Yeah, John, it has been. It's been difficult to take, and some extraordinary things have been said. There's just been the kind of extremes that she has provoked throughout her career, and now after death, have been extraordinary. David Cameron said on the day, "She saved our country," by which he meant she saved David Cameron's bit of the country. And as he said those words, more television sets were smashed in Britain than at any point in British history since Chris Waddle blazed a penalty over the bar in the World Cup semi-final against Germany in 1990. And it was interesting for me, Johnny. I grew up in the southeast in Tunbridge Wells, which is about as Tory as a town can possibly get without just flying off into orbit and looking down at the world saying, well, we are far better than you lot. And at my school, John, there were 600 teenage boys. That was the contents of my school. We had a school general election in 1992 to coincide with the real general election, and 550 of those boys voted for the Conservative candidate, which shows the independence of spirit that was fostered in places like that. And it was, I guess, only really was sort of when I sort of saw a bit more of the world than that small bit of Kent and Thatcher land that maybe I began to realise that she wasn't quite the goddess that she'd been presented. If you left a pile of 600 copies of Playboy magazine and 600 copies of a glossy magazine tribute to Margaret Thatcher at my school and said to the boys, you could take one magazine each, then 600 of those boys would take the Thatcher magazine, and the same 600 boys would then also take Playboy. But it just kind of shows the way she was viewed at that school. And then they would just rifle through Playboy looking to see if there are any bunnies of the month with bouffant hair and an aggressive-looking handbag.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with this week is there's a natural emotional process to go through, balancing what she did with who she was. And yes, she was the first female Prime Minister in the UK, which is unquestionably a landmark achievement. But she also blocked sanctions to South Africa during apartheid and famously took milk out of schools, which led to her nickname Maggie Thatcher, Milk Snatcher, or as some people rhymed it, Maggie Thatcher Total. Maybe, though, she's best remembered through some of her own words, too. One of her most famous quotes came from 1987 when she said, "There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families." Now, she didn't just talk the talk, Andy. She walked the walk. She didn't just believe that there was no such thing as society. She set about dismantling it in front of everyone's eyes to make sure that she was right. And that tonal whine of hers pairs perfectly with a slightly earlier quote where she argued that nobody would remember the Good Samaritan if he'd only had good intentions. He had money as well. What? Oh, that's right. That's the message to take away from the parable of the Good Samaritan, Andy, that the Samaritan was a successful small businessman. It wasn't it was a parable in private enterprise. Say what you like about Thatcher, Andy, and this week you can't, but she was nothing if she wasn't a free market theologian who listens to the story, Andy, of the Good Samaritan and thinks, wow, thank goodness he'd walked past so many needy people while building his business that he was able to help this poor wretch. I just hope that he leaves his welfare instincts at that, because at the end of the day, his first responsibility is to his shareholders.